All right. So welcome to my talk. I'm gonna try to explain it. Fair warning: this talk is gonna be a little weird. And I hope it'll have some thought-provoking design insight, and I hope nothing else is gonna be fun. But it crosses the intersection of these topics: wrestling and contemporary philosophy and mythology and memes. And at some point, video games is at the center of that. And it's gonna take some turns as I weave towards a point, but I promise I do have a point. It's going to take a little bit to explain. So, first of all, hi, I'm Bjarke. I'm a third-year PhD student at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm studying how ongoing live games tell stories. Before that, I did a master in media technology in Denmark, where I'm from, and I was made and studied narrative in games. I did a brief aside as a programmer in mobile games and have some experience with ARGs and escape rooms where some of these thoughts also came from. The broad claim I'm making initially here is that games make no sense. Perhaps you're confused, but really you probably already know this. I don't need to explain a lot of why games don't make sense because a lot of us just accept it intuitively. Specifically what I'm talking about is what I'm calling narrative nonsense, which is the idea that we look at something that happens in a game in terms of the story, we stop and think about it. It doesn't really make sense, but in the moment of playing the game, we just accept it unquestioningly. We just go, oh, it's a video game, it's fine. Obvious examples of stuff like healing. You get maimed in the leg or whatever, and you just like bandage your arm, and it's fine. You're moving on, no problem. Another example is more like deeper questions, like why are the champions in League of Legends fighting each other? How do they come back to life? How does the functions of that world actually make any sense? And it might sound here like I'm like encroaching into like ludonarrative dissonance discourse, and I'm not quite. It is related, and I'm going to talk about the relation later in the talk, but I'm talking about something slightly different, and I'm also not considering the nonsense a negative. To explain that, let me dive a little bit deeper into this example I had from League of Legends. Because the funny thing is that League of Legends actually used to have an explanation for why the champions were fighting. When the game came out, they had a whole fictional reasoning where the player was playing as summoners that were summoning these characters into the battlefield. They were all from these different dimensions. So they tried to explain this fictional stuff, and then they threw out that explanation in like 2014. They decided, nah, we rather want to tell different kinds of stories. So and they realized that this explanation was hamstringing their possibilities in some ways. So they thought, actually, we just want to tell the story about this world and these characters who are in it, and the gameplay is more of a byproduct of all these characters being in a world, but not necessarily have any connective tissue to the narrative we're doing. And they got even weirder than that because they made the canon more confusing by intentionally introducing alternate universes where the characters are now K-pop stars and K-pop bands or anime heroes and a bunch of other things that are completely unrelated to what they are in the fiction of League of Legends. And the thing about that is that League of Legends as a narrative product didn't get less popular because they got more popular. They got more fans, they got spread out to do more different kinds of things, and it's still going just as strong. And thus we can ask the question, how does the game even make sense? And you might shrug now and say, like, don't think about it too hard. And this is a literal quote given to me by, I was interviewing Destiny players on their understanding of the canon. And there's a little quote given to me by several players, but I am an academic, and I was like, I'm not going to accept this as just like an answer, so I'm going to ask why. Why don't we want to think about it too hard? Why do we know that we shouldn't try to unpack this? Because generally, in many other contexts, humans want things to make sense. We look often at things that don't make sense and try to understand them. See the entire field of science. See modern audiences' obsession with plot holes in movies and stuff like that. Hartmut Rosa, who's a contemporary philosopher and sociologist, talks about how we as humans, especially in the modern age, want to make sense of the world. We want to grasp it and control it and understand it. Because humans have a hard time just letting things be the way they are. You specifically talk about this concept of controllability, making the world something we can comprehend and adjust and change. So why do we accept the nonsense in video games? Why do we dismiss a lot of video games as like, it's fine. And you could do that with most of the things I'm saying in this talk, and you would be kind of right. And that's kind of my point. That's weird. So throughout this talk, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples that are slowly going to try to convince you to let go of this notion that the world should make sense. Because this is a natural human impulse, and sometimes it's actually a good thing to be fine with nonsense. And my first example of this is wrestling. I did warn you, this is only the beginning. It's going to get weird. I'm specifically talking about professional wrestling here, the sports entertainment product, not the martial art of wrestling. Because, and to write a very brief history, it originally probably came from carnival games that eventually became more and more scripted into as the bookers setting on the fights realized that the audience wanted a specific outcome every time. And so it turned into a spectacle and a story rather than a sport. This is a quote from Ronald Barthes in the 50s talking about this. Or, as Henry Jenkins talked about it, serialized fiction from men. And I'm talking about this because wrestling makes no sense. The diathesis of wrestling is highly weird. Because it is scripted and as a narrative product, but it's also part of the real world and unavoidably so. When we talk about the character of The Rock starring in a movie, that can and has been referenced in the fiction of wrestling by other wrestlers, and that asks many weird questions about, does that mean that the entirety of cinema is part of the fiction of wrestling? Other examples are the fact that accidents do happen in the fictional world of wrestling or in the real world, and thus the fiction has to change and adjust based on what's happening in the real world, and it just co-opts the real world and begins to using it narratively. This is Ric Flair, or Richard Morgan Flair, I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name. And a famous quote about wrestling talks about, if you shake hands with this person, you're kind of shaking hands with both the born person and also the persona of Ric Flair, and you can't really separate where one begins and the other ends. They are, in some ways, both people. This gets into the notion of kayfabe, which is a wrestling term that talks about the idea that the people who watch wrestling and perform wrestling insist that the world is real, and that's part of the performance. Like staying in kayfabe means that you act as if wrestling is not scripted, even though everyone accepts and knows that it is. And this leads to so many things where wrestling is so obviously nonsense that if you try to dismiss it as, oh, well, it's scripted or it's fake, that's kind of missing the point, because the fact that it is so obviously nonsense is the point of wrestling. It is the muddling and the confusion is part of it. It is part of the joy of fans to try to suss out what is scripted and what isn't, when is something kayfabe, when it is breaking with it. And it's kind of akin to a magic trick. You know you're being fooled, but that's kind of the point, and you know if you learned the answer, it would be less interesting. So bringing this back to video games, I'm not the first person to compare video games to wrestling. William Van Clay had this in 2009 when they compared to World of Warcraft, which has a lot of similarities. They both have long-running storylines. They have this strange muddy diathesis because World of Warcraft is also taking place in real time and thus is in parallel with the real world and is influenced by real-world events. And these characters thus exist in this weird boundary state where it both exists in a virtual world and outside of it. World of Warcraft specifically is so similar because it is an online live service games. Or as I call them, perennial games, which is a term that I have come up with in my PhD studies to explain games like the ones shown here and try to understand them as experiences that tell stories. I use the term perennial intentionally because these games have perennial properties. Like a perennial plant, they're something that exists for a very long time, and they also have predictably recurring patterns. Experiences like the long-running TV shows or sports or a game like World of Warcraft all have a recurring thing that happens. An episode is released every week, a new match is played, a new patch is released. And each of these things individually don't change that much about the fabric of the thing, but over time, these slow changes eventually change the very experience of what it is into something different than what it was 2 years ago. And there are a lot of these kinds of experiences that I'm not going to have time to go into, so I'm specifically for this and for my studies looking at perennial games, which is a kind of perennial experiences. And And I'm focusing on for this talk also because perennial games kind of inherently need to rely on nonsense. Similar to wrestling, there's a lot of this because of their real live nature that they just can't get away from trying to explain everything, and therefore just have to lean into and accept the fact that there's parts of them that don't make any sense. Questions about this are stuff like repetition. How does it make sense to tell a story in a world like World of Warcraft where a character dies every day as characters kill a boss, and then that boss respawns, and then they come back to kill it again? Other questions I've kind of already covered about the ideas of truth, but these and what is true about the world. Rarely does any single action by a player actually change the world, and you can take stuff inside the world and pull it outside. And finally, because of that, the whole notion of authorship is in question, because actions of players can become fictionalized and immortalized later by the developers, and thus we don't the boundary of what exactly the authorship is unstated. And a move that I do in my PhD work is that I found that you can look at these perennial stories as a kind of myth. And what I mean by this is that we're looking at them as communal storytelling. They are stories by and for communities, and they're stories that communicate something about the shared history, values, and norms and perspectives of the community that's telling them, and they can be part of the they can do active construction of these myths by reenacting, retelling these experiences with each other. A famous example from World of Warcraft is Leroy Jenkins, which is a video of a raid gone wrong that went viral because it was funny. But it's spread much wider than that, and it is something that pretty much any person who's played World of Warcraft, and many people who never have heard of. He also became a fictional character inside the World of Warcraft as the developers added him in, kind of showing that they're waiting on the joke. He's also a card in Hearthstone. My point here is that Leroy Jenkins is a mythological figure. He's become something so well known and so well accepted. He's part of the ongoing collective myth of World of Warcraft. He is accepted as something that players understand, and you can reference to. And myth has a bunch of other examples, a bunch of other benefits that I'm not going to go into here. We can talk about it later. I talked about this in last year's iKids. I'm just going to briefly mention one of them by saying that, I'm not saying that perennial games are necessarily myths, but that we can view them as myth, and that provides a series of useful perspectives. And to answer that question of repetition, how can storytelling make sense in a world where major characters die every day? Well, myths function through repetition. Retellings of myths were how they survived and propagated and mattered and prospered in society. So if we instead see a repetition as the same event happening again, we can see them as a retelling or a ritualized reenactment of a previous event. Every time players go in to kill a raid boss, the character doesn't die again, but we can view that as a reenactment of the first time that happened. Not unlike a storyteller telling a myth again and again to an audience. Because every single time the storyteller tells that story, it's a little different, and it slowly changes over time. Players learn new strategies, they get new context to what the boss is. And slowly, the story of what the boss fight is changes through repetition. Because myths, like wrestling and video games, make no sense. It is sort of baked into in how we use the word myth today, that the nature of whether these stories are true is very complicated. Because myths are typically not entirely true. They were traditionally often spoken as if to believe to be real, yet most we know are not. And the colloquial interpretation of the word myth is exactly as a story we once believed to be true, but is not. The myth of the universal narrative, for example. And yet scholars began understanding myths as a way to view socially constructed ideas about societies, and we can learn something true about the people telling these stories. They become more more allegorical, metaphorical rather than like actually true. And to complicate this more, traditional mythology often contradicts itself. Sorting out the timeline of Greek mythology is very complicated and doesn't really make a lot of sense because the characters from one story to the next didn't need to match up. And if I'm allowed to ask another dumb question, we can ask, does Arthas exist? Which you might not really say no to, but here's a quote from a participant in a survey, in an interview study done by Steph Oppers, talking about the religion in World of Warcraft, saying essentially that to them, the gods in World of Warcraft exist compared to the gods in real life, which do not. And what they, of course, mean here is that they exist in the fiction. Compared to real world where we believe something that we can never prove. However, in a video game like World of Warcraft, the player's actions, despite them perhaps being non-fictional, sometimes have fictional implications, such as killing the fictional character of World of Warcraft, fictional character of Arthas, and therefore their actions are both real and not real, both in the fiction and outside. How it has this concept of real enough. We play as if we believe this could have been real, but we simultaneously accept that it isn't, but it is real enough. And it is part of the perennial experience to discuss what is real and what is not. Like in wrestling, this is very much part of the point of the experience. And this is what fans argue about when they argue about what is canon. Because in canon, fans typically discuss this kind of stuff by making something that is not canon, like fan fiction and fan art and so on. But perhaps they discuss things. Perhaps they make things they want to be, or perhaps intentionally subverting the expectations and making an alternate universe they know would never happen. But we also see sometimes things fan produced become so accepted by the fandom it either becomes directly canon or something called the fanon, which is like I think it is so accepted yet never truly like acknowledged by the authors. And finally, we can see fans having nuanced, complicated ideas of how to understand the concept of canon. This is one example from the Sherlock Holmes fandom, which talks about either understanding the world through the Doyleist, from Conan Doyle, which is viewing the stories as made by the author, and inconsistencies are probably just him making a mistake, or the Watsonian perspective, looking at as if the stories are literally written by a person called John Watson, to try to understand the world is internally consistent, and we must explain inconsistencies through real-world explanations. And this will come to my first conclusion, which is that nonsense builds community. Because something that is nonsense is something that is up for discussion. This discussion is part of how communities grow. People love figuring out nonsense and making sense of things that they don't understand, and they like coming together to do this. And fans very much discuss what makes sense and what doesn't as part of the experience. It was in fact very much the function of traditional mythology to explain nonsense. They were trying to figure out how the world made sense to them. And storytelling was a way for them to do this. And so this leads me to talking about Elden Ring. We see this in the lore communities that spring up around all the FromSoft games. As they gather all these different clues about the world, and we see an immense amount of activity and effort coming out in fan communities, making sense of these tiny small snippets of world building, and the amount of work that they put into this is staggering. However, that's actually not the primary thing I want to talk about. Because I want to talk about something else that builds community as well, and it was decidedly more silly. You see, most players in Elden Ring would arrive at this boss called Melania. She's widely considered to be the hardest boss in the game. She's brutal. It punishes pretty much every mistake you do. And fictionally, this correlates because she fictionally has never lost a battle until the player come along supposing to defeat her, which many players fail to do. But for this story, I want to not just focus on any player defeating her, but a very famous player who became known for defeating her. This guy called Let Me Solo Her. What players found often as they approached the boss, where they saw this little summoning sign, which is the way you can summon other players to help you in Elden Ring. And the only text, and instead of where there would normally be a name, it just said the text, "Let me solo her." And you summon this person in who's entirely naked except for a pot and 2 katanas and a loincloth. And he did go in and solo her, and again and again and again. And did this over and over. And over time, this legend of this mythical person spread on the internet, and it became a meme in the literal sense. He spread virally as people began making fan art and fan songs about him. The devs even sent him a sword. And he began streaming and became quite well known in the community. And my point is not just that he became a big story, and that's interesting. But my point is that Let Me Solar in large part became so big because he's ridiculous. Look at him. It is kind of nonsensical that a naked guy with a pot on his head can defeat the sword who was never known defeat. That's funny. And From Software games often rely on this ridiculous nature. They have armor that doesn't make any functional sense. They often have brevity and humor in between the giant god-slaying fights and big fire music, and it's often a forgotten aspect of why these games are so successful. That they are often but there are elements of them that are quite spreadable and funny and something that builds community. Because nonsense makes people talk. We often talk about the power of word of mouth for a variety of things, and nonsense is something that literally gives people something to mouth words about. It is tweetable. It is viral. A lot of the stuff that gets viral is viral because it's nonsense. And of course, there is a balance. I'm talking about something that is not quite so nonsensical that it's complete gibberish and incomprehensible, but something that is just nonsense enough that it makes us puzzled, confused, and intrigued. It pulls us in. Now, I know the audience here, and some of you might say that I don't make online games, I make single-player narrative games. First of all, I would say that communities exist around those two, and they also want something to talk about. But I can provide a different example. This is Ocarina of Time. This is from 1998. It is not a modern perennial game. But Ocarina of Time is very much nonsense. I say this because I played it in 2018 as an adult, 5 years ago. And frankly, coming in with modern sensibilities of world building and storytelling in games, I was very surprised by what this game actually was. So a quick recap if you haven't played it, or if you played it a long time ago. This is a game with large open plains with flying flower things, undead skeletons, zombies, Chinese dragons, chickens, fake chickens that live inside your pocket, fairies, and other kinds of fairies, fire you can put inside a bottle, room that looks like it belongs to an interstellar, there's a talking scarecrows, and a giant whale with electricity monsters inside it. There's poetry and a conga line done by people who only eat gourmet rocks. There's cat people who only exist inside a labyrinth. There's time travel, and a ghost that shoots fireballs, and a windmill that lowers the water level. It has a song so powerful it can destroy an ancient family grave by summoning a lightning strike. It has several dimensions and destinies and talking trees and old wars and royal families and elevators powered by the sun somehow. Ocarina of Time doesn't make any sense. And very little of that is explained any more than I just did right now. In terms of its quote-unquote lore and world building, it is utter nonsense. It is also one of the most beloved games of all time. And part of this is that nonsense is memorable. I remember a lot of this game. It was, it sticks in my head because it was interesting and strange and weird, and every single new thing that came up made me go, huh, that's cool. And the recent resurgence in Japanese games especially seems to have really figured this out. Games like Yakuza and Zelda and Final Fantasy swing violently between sincere drama and slapstick comedy, and they do so effortlessly. And they've been very successful at doing so. And this all happens because of the thing I stated in the beginning. The brain wants things to make sense. And thus, we look at something that almost makes sense and go, huh, that's intriguing. Many modern games, however, aim for internally consistent, coherent worlds. They want to explain everything. And don't get me wrong, I like big epic fantasy and well-realized worlds. I'm not dissuading any of these games. I'm more saying it is often considered a mark of quality to do this, but you can also intentionally go against internal consistency, and this has its own aesthetics and benefits. And when it goes wrong to go for the complete explain everything approach, it at worst leads to the player having no questions, no mysteries, no one. Here I want to return to Hartmut Rosa again, because what he's saying with this quote is that in trying to make sense of the world, we can lose a connection with it. We try to like maintain distance and keep it at bay to try to understand it, because we are worried that it's going to affect us, and if it does that, then we cannot actually fully understand what it is. And he mentions this concept of resonance as a counterpoint. Moments of resonance are where the world touches us. It is where it is moments we remember and care for, because there are moments where we are not in full control. It is neither where we have no control at all, but rather he talks about this concept of half controllability, where we are not wholly out of control and not entirely in control, but we are resonant in the world. These are the moments where we really live, where we feel something, where we allow the world to change us. And nonsense, what nonsense does here is it snaps us out of this critical cruel distance. We are shaken up and forced to re-engage with what the game is doing on its terms. We need to lean in and ask questions. We become present. This brings me to the concept of lacunae, which is a concept mentioned in a recent Polaris report done by several clever game designers about it, encouraging emergent player stories. And this is concept of leaving gaps in your worlds and in your games, things that invite answers, but by leaving intentionally unanswered questions, you invite the players to prod and poke and theorize about what's going on. This is great for community for some of the reasons I've already covered, for example, in FromSoft games. But there are also other kinds of lacuna. Jacob Geller did a video on Shadow of the Colossus, on a specific Shadow of the Colossus community that existed for 10 years after the game came out to try to solve one of the last mysteries in that game. Because lacunae aren't necessarily always doing something funny on nonsensical, they can also just be open questions about how to interpret the world. In Shadow of the Colossus case, this was probably an unintentional thing left in the players were like expecting about, because there was nothing for the community there to actually find. But it gave the community something to do for 10 years. The Polaris report reversely actually mentions a situation where developers did this intentionally. In Boyfriend Dungeon, they had questions about how some aspects of their world building worked that they intentionally didn't tell the players. They kept this hidden from them, both throughout the game and throughout the social media. And they just had questions that players were left to wonder for themselves, and the community was left to come up with answers on their own. You may have heard of the iceberg metaphor in writing and world building, which is the idea that you should only show 10% of the world building you're doing to your reader. And generally, they're considered good advice that you should know the answers yourself, which is true. However, especially in live storytelling, you can leave. You're often left in situations where you perhaps don't entirely want to explain things for yourself. In the moment, but you may want to leave yourself a hole that you can fill in later down the line. We all know the power of a good tabletop role-playing campaign that can improvise on the fly based on what the players are doing. And if you filled out every possible aspect of the world before then their room to do so is lessened. And remember that developers are not immune to the human desire for controllability either. We also want to explain things. It is a natural urge, and we want to tell our players what's going on. We don't like seeing other people with questions that we have the answers to. It's a very normal and human, compassionate response to want to explain things about the world. And it's often considered a mark of quality to create deep, detailed worlds that have a lot of answers in them. And nonsense can feel like a mistake that needs fixing. It can almost feel like a bug or an oversight, or something you just haven't figured out yet, but that you should get to really. And so I want to bump in with a word of caution here that it may sound like I'm saying that we should make our games nonsense on purpose, or like make more nonsense, and I'm not quite saying that. Simply just not answering questions is not always going to succeed. Nonsense can very easily become too much, and it's very easy to make something so nonsensical we also just lose interest in because there's nothing for us there to do or to grasp onto. I'm more saying, don't worry when there already is nonsense. Games already have plenty of ways to not make sense inherently, and we probably don't need to force it that much, and likely won't work if we try to force the nonsense when there isn't any there. And this is where the specter of ludonarrative dissonance comes back, because ludonarrative dissonance, as it was talked about, was really when this did not work, when players noticed the nonsense in a bad way and became dissonant. But when the narrative nonsense work, it doesn't quite mean that it's ludonarratively harmonious, but rather it still exists as nonsense that we accept, because we know it leads to better experiences, and it leads us to again lead in and ask questions, which can be fun to try to answer. I want to also leave with a few notes on how you can think about games or how you can think about generating nonsense in your games, or methods that we already do today that are great for this. Stuff like procedural generation. It's like one of the strengths of procedural generation, that it generates a lot of things that sound very strange at first, but then we go, I wonder how that makes sense. Because it combines things in unpredictable ways that we as humans wouldn't have thought of beforehand. User-generated content is also great. If you're still on Twitter, you've probably seen the floods of videos from Tears of the Kingdom, with people coming out with all manner of constructions that don't really make any fictional sense in the world of Zelda. Because the designers have given players the ability to express themselves in many more ways, and that includes things that make no sense, but yet still is quite fun for players to express themselves through. And finally, live development, as already explained through examples like wrestling and World of Warcraft, because they are affected by real-time activity, become inherently more nonsensical. And Blazeball, rest in peace, was so powerful because it utilized all three. And it leaned into its nonsense that it generated through all these methods in a very literal way, and became something much more than just than it ever would have if it just like tried to stay in a prim normal path. What I'm really saying here broadly is that nonsense is emergent narrative fuel. It powers our ability to combine elements into stories. It can lead to fun, memorable moments and resonant moments for players and designers. Finally, the broader point here is that coherence, when it doesn't work, can shrink, or like coherence in general, can shrink the possibility space. Once you know all the possible variables in a world and how far they can go, it becomes predictable. Once you've filled out all the holes, there's nothing left. And what nonsense does is it shatters these rules. It breaks open the possibility space again. Players begin to ask, if this is possible, what else might be? Owls? And so I will end with this final piece of advice from the owl, from Legend of Zelda, which is that you go forth and know that you'll be fine with accepting some nonsense. Take questions.
So some of the things that you showed, like the iceberg, seemed to be like, oh, you have all the answers, and then you just don't only show the players a little bit, and then there is a right answer, I'm just not telling you.
Yeah.
And then some of them, like Lacuna, are like, I don't know the answer either, I think, is what it was. So, yeah, like, you can theorize, I don't have an answer myself. So I'm just wondering, like, what is it, like a way you can know, like, hey, maybe this can stay nonsense, maybe this can stay unexplained, like a specific aspect of your story, like, I don't need to explain this, or maybe this does need a little bit of explanation so that you can grasp onto something. Like, how can you like sort those out? If you know.
Yeah, I don't think I have the complete answer to that.
That's fair.
The question for the Discord was how do you know when you should try to explain something and when you should leave it as nonsense? And I don't think I have the exact. I don't think I have like a good like short answer to that. I think it's a very complicated thing to do, and I think it's something that developers are often struggling with knowing as well. I think there's stuff like if we you can like there's often more the core narrative. If you have like a typical meme story or something that like you want everyone to experience, that typically has to make a little more sense just because it's the thing everyone goes through and everyone sort of needs to understand, and that's like the foundation upon which everything else is. And then you often have the slightly weirder stuff in the frictions, like the stuff that's weird in Yakuza is often the side quests. Is often like the things that don't. Those are where like the weirdnesses of the world come out, and like the main story is often very straight faced. So like if you build that foundation of something that is like quite normal, then the nonsense is something to like subvert, right? So I think that's a good way to do it. And but also there's like a question of like how much you need to answer a thing right now. An example I know from Destiny was that they had, and I will admit I don't know the internal process. So I don't know if they did have an answer for this. I'm just projecting that they probably didn't. They had a planet where they had a sea monster that was like mentioned and referenced like 6 years ago, 5 years ago, and it's only just now that we finally know what that sea monster is. And I don't think they knew at the time what that was, but it's like here's a thing we can use later. Once we have a need to explain a sea monster, we can use that. So it's like if you leave yourself intentionally these like open questions for yourself, but like have rooms, places in the world that's like, all right, if I ever need this kind of thing, if I ever need like a good horror story, I have a mansion over here, like something like that. You know? So yeah.
Thank you.
I really love this talk. Very, in itself, is a fuel for thinking about possibility. Now, there's I have one question, which is, so you talk a lot about nonsense and not nonsense, sort of in terms of like what makes some rational sense versus not. But there are other modes in which we also like create, as far as like, there might be like generating a couple of solutions that have associations with each other that don't fit into like the context of the world. How do some of the other ways that the developers, storytellers solve things kind of fit into this model?
Can you explain a bit more what you mean by?
Let me say it like simpler because I made that really complicated. What do you think about other ways that storytelling is solved other than creating a consistent world where I'm continuing to make it complicated, so I'll think about it.
Okay, we can talk later.
Yeah.
So, it's that time of the afternoon. I think it's going to be a little bit hard to maybe make coherent thoughts, but I'm going to try. Thank you for this talk. This was I think a really useful provocation for me as someone who likes to think about like narrative sense making and like mental models
Same,
and
honestly.
right, and kind of like particularly like systemic narratives, which for me are all about sort of like training the player to develop a consistent mental model of a thing, and then like use that mental model in new and creative ways to do things that make sense in like the logic of the game. Right. And so I'm kind of like, is there, I think I'm kind of trying to figure out an answer to something like the first person's question of like, what are some general guidelines we can follow about when this works? And maybe as a hypothesis, right? Like since you like mentioned this concept of myth and canon a bunch, like especially in the beginning, something that I think a lot about is how we sort of lean on players' game literacy and like genre expectations, and particularly if we bring in like mythological characters and their kind of like expectations about what those characters can do. I mean, is there some sense in which like relying on the characters' sort of external knowledge of the world can be a guideline for when we can leave things unsaid, or or is it just something more like maybe there's a core to it where you have to make a certain amount of sense to make your game work, but then everything else, if it's like, can kind of follow what my friend calls airbud rules, which are like, if it's not explicitly in the rules, then then it's fair game and you don't have to explain it, right?
Yeah.
Mythology and airbud rules maybe are the two hypotheses there. What do you think of this?
Yeah. So again, like before, I don't have any complete answers either. I think those are valid. I think those are very valuable. Like as I explained, like the vocabulary of myth was really helpful to me as to explain some of these things that didn't make sense to me and like how I could understand them. So I think so in that sense, I think you're right. But I don't know if I have any other concrete design ideas right now on how to do it other than what I said before necessarily. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that they could be interesting to work towards. Like try to figure out what is something that absolutely cannot be nonsense and what are we fine leaving it.
Yeah, I just want to say really great talk. I feel like this talk has explained a lot of things about. I feel like this made me realize my spouse likes things has a much higher nonsense tolerance than me. So like if there's a little bit of nonsense, I'm like, no, I don't like that. Like my spouse is like crazy. Like we're watching like the Elden Ring war videos, like they're willing to accept all that. Whereas I'm like no, it doesn't make sense. So I think maybe I feel like it's subjective. Maybe these questions, like some things will work for some people, and some people have a very high nonsense tolerance. Whereas I'm just like that doesn't work. Like my brain doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
And I'll also mention, I think it's so interesting to hear you mention how you played the game in 1998, then you revisited it in like 2018, and how maybe we as people, our nonsense spectrum maybe changes from time to time.
Yes.
And wow, so I echo a lot of what was said. Thank you. This is a really cool thought. It got me thinking really deep about some of this.
I definitely think that the modern video game player is way less accepting of if I could time period today, it would be trashed. Like people would like hate it. And you would not be like people would like I can't write this on a wiki. What are you talking about? Like they would not like it. So yeah, for sure. You had a question?
Well, I was just thinking about how it seems like part of this is that there has to be an investment by the players to begin with.
Yes.
For the nonsense to be accepted. I mean, if it's just pure nonsense and they don't care, you're not going to get that friction, you're not going to get that dialogue.
Exactly.
That generates it. Also, I thought that what you were talking before about Sherlock Holmes was really interesting because I've been reading about the history of the Bakersfield, the Bakersfield Irregular, that's actually the Baker Street Irregulars.
Yes.
And how they called it the game. Mm-hmm. They viewed it as the game's afoot.
Yeah.
And even though it wasn't a video game, it wasn't fiction, they found a way into Sherlock Holmes to the point that they were producing chronologies of all of the stories and books, going to the point where they're reading in those stories like phases of the moon, therefore it would have been this time of the month, this year, and so forth. It's really interesting. I do have a question.
Yeah.
What is an ocarina?
Oh, it's the instrument. It is an instrument that you get in the game.
Okay.
Similar to a flute, you want to hear across it and have some holes to kind of modulate it.
Yeah, I also did not know what ocarina was before I played the game. It's a very niche instrument. On your previous point, let me just find this book. I just recommend this book, which talks about fandoms in the early 19th century. Specifically Sherlock Holmes and Lovecraft and Lord of the Rings fandoms, way before the internet existed, and talks about stuff like how they came together and like formed early what we today would call an early fandom, but back then they didn't have that language. Super fascinating.
First. Yeah, I can go first.
So there's a notion in the Golden Vow and various other occult writings of the last 2 centuries that ritual is a reenactment of event. Does this mean that playing a perennial game is a form of natural ritual?
Yes, I would absolutely say that. Yes, 100%. Like I'm like actively right now looking at like these games as a kind of ritual. Another question?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to thank you because this was a great talk and helped me realize like the factors that go into how certain communities thrive. Like I don't know if you're familiar with the anime mashups at all, but I'm talking like yeah, like they'll combine like Curtis Mayfield with some anime opening,
Right.
like in the weirdest ways possible, but it works. And there's like a whole thriving scene about it. And I realized like it's because it's like pure nonsense, but like Jim mentioned, there's like an investment into it.
Yeah.
Like about theory and about like keeping track of like okay, make sure to know like which beats correspond or like the BPMs, which ones match and all that.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.